With Wicked 2, Wicked for Good, coming out, we are coming up on 125 years in the world of the wonderful Wizard of Oz. I'm sure you know the book, the movie, the musical. But did you know that there are 13 other books in the original series? Welcome, fellow curiosos, old and new. I am C, and this is my channel, Useless Genius. I am no genius, but that's okay. This channel is dedicated to appreciating everything that other people might deem useless. So if that sounds good to you, please join the community here and like, subscribe, comment, etc. I hope you enjoy this Wicked episode. Whether you are a fan of the Oz books, the Gregory Maguire series, or the musical, I hope this video has a little something for you. Honestly, initially I thought about doing a whole deep dive on the entire series, as I read them all when I was a kid, because my dad had that OG iPad and you could download them all royalty free on the iBook store. So, I'm pretty educated on this topic. But I soon realized there were way too many stories to cover. I could in no way do them all justice. So I'm just going to talk about the second book, The Marvelous Land of Oz. But first, a quick recap of the original, for those of you that, somehow might have forgotten. Then I'll talk about some of the feminist influences on the author Frank L. Baum, its queer themes, and finally tie it together with Wicked. So get ready.
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
So this is the one we all know and love. It was written by Frank L. Baum and first published in 1900. Baum was actually a failed playwright, and he was supporting himself by working at a local newspaper while writing the Oz series. It was a huge bestseller, and the first book was adapted in 1938 as The Wizard of Oz, much to Baum's delight. We're introduced to Dorothy Gale, who is whisked away from her farmhouse in Kansas and ends up in the land of Oz, in Munchkinland in particular. She, of course, famously kills the Wicked Witch of the East. From there on, she meets beloved characters such as Glinda, the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and the Cowardly Lion. The trio go to Oz, hoping that their wishes will be granted. But, of course, it is not that simple. As we all know, the Wizard of Oz is not who he says he is. And I'd like to include a brief note about some of the discrepancies between the books and the movies that I think might be of interest to Wicked fans. In the original books, there are no animals in the city of Oz, and I've wondered if Gregory Maguire, the author of Wicked, was inspired by this detail, and he really elaborated on the class discrepancies between animals and humans in the Wizard of Oz world. Another interesting detail is that the Wizard of Oz appears in different forms to each of the characters, kind of to show how manipulative he is. For example, he's a big head to Dorothy, a monster to the Tin Man, a beautiful woman to the Scarecrow, and a ball of fire to the Lion. I think we'll be seeing these scenes in Wicked for Good, at least from the trailer, so I'd really like to see where the director takes this. Okay, onto the book. The second book, The Marvelous Land of Oz. So this book starts out in a completely different place than the first one. Dorothy Gale has returned to Kansas, and we are introduced to our new protagonist, a country boy named Tip. He lives in the North of Oz under the rule of a cruel, wicked witch, but not the one you're thinking of. This witch is named Mombi. She'll be important later. He runs away with his friend, Jack Pumpkinhead, who, I wonder what he looks like. Yeah, he looks like a Tim Burton character, basically. Naturally, they head to the Emerald City, and from there, the books become a kind of political or military thriller. They have to do with this complicated war with different factions of Oz who have been fighting ever since the disappearance of Princess Ozma. One of the most powerful factions is an all-women army that is led by the fierce General Gingibar, who is trying to invade. Her conflict with Glinda the Good over who should rule Emerald City is one of the central plot points of the book. But luckily, the lost, Princess of Oz, Ozma, is eventually returned to the crown of the Emerald City.
And they all lived happily ever after.
Now, I'll get into the real meat of the video with the character of Ozma, but first, I wasn't actually sure if I would include this in the original video, but I went on such a long tangent while researching that I felt like it was just too interesting to ignore. Frank L. Baum, the author's mother-in-law, named Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and she worked on the Underground Railroad and became involved in the suffragette movement. She authored many articles that were very critical of the status quo at the time, and in her book, Women, Church, and State, she wrote about how Christianity had oppressed women, very much part of the same debate that we are having today. She also criticized the U.S. government at the time in an article, Indian Citizenship, by describing how the U.S. was not properly upholding treaties with Native Americans and instead trying to forcibly assimilate them. Another monograph titled Women Inventors, well, it's pretty self-explanatory what that's about, but she gets into a really nuanced discussion about how the issue is not just underestimating women's intelligence, but also about the legal rights and monetary benefits that women were denied due to their inability to file patents. Gloria Steinem famously said that Matilda was the woman who was ahead of the women who were ahead of their time. I seriously could make a whole video on her. Her background is super interesting, but we must go on. Basically, I bring this all up as kind of backdrop to what circles that Baum found himself in and why he included so many female characters in positions of power. I wouldn't say that the politics of Oz are always coherent, however, as this still is a children's story, and I think that Baum was most likely influenced by the elements around him rather than intentionally trying to create a political narrative in the Oz books. However, the Wicked author Gregory Maguire, I think, notices these kind of progressive strains and really thinks them through and elaborates on them, which is what makes the Wicked series so compelling. Okay, now onto the themes of gender and sexuality in this book. I think that this is where the second volume in the Oz series stands out to most people and why scholars have returned to it over and over again. As there's actually a whole field of scholarly research on children's literature and the queer themes in it, which, okay, before I get any accusations, this is not about sexualizing children. It's no more sexualizing than when adults point to two kids in the playground and are like, hey, are they boyfriend and girlfriend? No, they're 3 years old. I don't know. It's a little strange to me. And to put that conversation in more academic terms, a leading scholar in the field, Tyson Pugh, writes, quote, "Children cannot retain their innocence of sexuality while learning about normative heterosexuality. Yet this inherent paradox runs throughout many classic narratives of children's literature." Basically, here Pugh uses queer as, quote, "a descriptor of disruptions to prevailing cultural codes of sexual and gender normativity." Basically, he's talking about how children aren't actually allowed to just, play together freely without judgment. They often have pressure put on them from an early age, such as young girls who have to wear dresses, give valentines to boys, and be demure, to make boys like them. In return, boys are not supposed to cry or show too much emotion or be intimate with each other. Instead, they're supposed to be cold, reserved, macho, tough, strong, all of those stereotypes of masculinity. And of course, none of these characteristics are bad on their own, but it's when they are dictated to children before those children can actually discover who they are and develop their own sense of self. So this field of research is looking at children's stories that do not conform to these norms or are in some sort of tension with them. That is the queerness that we're talking about, not necessarily speculating on the specific sexualities of certain characters. And we see this lack of conformity as a central theme in the Oz books. Which, before you roll your eyes and say, well, yeah, doesn't every children's novel have quirky characters? Which, yes, but I have been withholding some pretty key details from you. Sorry. I've been keeping secrets about this 100-year-old novel. So in the whole story, right, there's this talk of the Princess Ozma, who's mysteriously disappeared. And at the end of the book, we find out our protagonist, Tip, actually is Princess Ozma. Ozma was turned into a boy by the evil witch, Mombi. She also makes a later appearance in the Wicked novels, FYI. Not sure what to make of this, Glinda and his friends reassure him. The Tin Woodsman consoles him with, quote, "Never, old chap, it don't hurt to be a girl, I'm told, and we'll all remain your faithful friends just the same. And to be honest with you, I've always considered girls nicer than boys." I don't know what I was doing with my voice there, but anyways, these reassurances are all it takes. Tip is incredibly nervous, but he decides he must do it. So the curse is undone, and he appears again as Princess Ozma. And then we have the last chapter of the book. Yes, this whole dramatic plotline is really not treated as such. It's treated just like a twist in any other kind of short story or novel, and everything from there wraps up pretty beautifully. Everyone accepts Ozma's rule, and Ginger backs down, and Ozma rules perfectly, and they all live happily ever after. The last sentence to even mention the character of Tip is when the Ozma returns, another character informs everyone that, quote, "The long-lost Princess Ozma has been discovered in no less a personage than the boy Tip." He's not mentioned again because, frankly, why would he be? But from there, Princess Ozma becomes a staple character in the other 12 books in the Oz series. She keeps all of her friends, creates many new relationships, and is beloved by all. Which I feel like this book would now be called like woke and banned by Republicans. To consider Ozma a transgender character is personally, I think up to the reader. But I think the important takeaway from the story is we're introduced to this character as a boy. But then they realize they are meant to be a girl, and their friends all assure them that that's okay. They'll love them just the same. And it's also, I think, important to recognize that no one thinks that the identity previously of Tip was false or, talks about it'll be such a great loss. Our friend Tip. There's really no fuss made about it. It's just seen as a natural continuation of the friendship. After all, people change, and fundamentally, it's still the same person. From there on, everyone accepts their identity as a girl, and life moves on. The story continues. I feel like the debate in the US has gotten so fervorous and hateful, when at the end of the day, we should allow children and adults to live as whatever identity brings them the most joy. And we should leave the medical stuff to medical professionals. Which, by the way, the medical professionals have spoken. Scholar Lucas Crawford, who is trans himself, praises the text for representing the agency of the transgender minor and not falling into the typical lessons of children's literature, which is to obey your guardians and authority. From here on, I'll be discussing the super interesting article of his in the anthology book Queering the Countryside, New Frontiers in Rural Queer Studies. Baum's text restores the child from essentially the figure to the agent, albeit in a fantasy world, where one who engages in relational gender making and makes relationships rather than, quote, merely fits into or threatens a pre-existing family form. Basically, this is all academic speak for saying that the characters in this book are not told how to relate to each other on the basis of gender. It's not that Tip tries to behave a certain way towards Jack Pumpkinhead because they're both boys, and so they can't have a certain type of relationship and must keep a certain emotional or physical distance. Nor does Tip look at someone like Glinda and immediately develop a crush on them or have to treat her demurely because she's a girl. Lucas Crawford goes on to describe the various queer members of Tip's found family, such as Jack Pumpkinhead, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, as well as the animated Sawhorse and a Wogglebug. Basically, none of his characters are going to have, traditional gender relationships. I feel like the closest thing we get to is the Tin Man and his lost love. That story is not really developed until further novels. There's also a really interesting paradigm between the city and the country in these novels. After all, we all know the Emerald City as the place where dreams come true, where you can get your wish, and where all of our characters aspire to, following the yellow brick road, and so on. And Crawford makes a really interesting point here, how in the Oz books, the characters who feel at odds in the countryside aren't necessarily given a accepting, warm welcome in the Emerald City. Yes, it seems nice. They're still the kind of queer oddballs that they always were. In this article, he writes, quote, "This is a very verbose way of saying that trans youth growing up in rural parts of the country don't always connect with the story of trans people in media. After all, they are given very limited images of what trans people can look like. So it's natural that, not everyone is going to relate to one or two characters." However, I think we are starting to see more representations in the domain with the rise of artists like Ethel Cain and Chappell Roan, who tell stories of queer people growing up in rural environments. We've also seen a huge uptick in queer artists in the country space with the rise of stars like Lil Nas X. Ethel Cain specifically has talked about how important it is for her to stick to her roots.
If you come from a place that is not connected at all, and that's what gets you successful, why the hell would I move to Los Angeles? Why would I leave the well, love where I grew up, just the landscape itself, the people, I'm like, I want to walk into the grocery store barefoot and not have people look at me funny. I'm like, that is what I want.
I think she's someone who is currently defying these narratives of moving to the city and becoming more palatable, in part by abandoning your rural past. And this is such an interesting and important conversation, given that conservatives are currently attacking cities as teeming with, liberal transgender ideology and infringing on rural America. Yeah, the reality is much more complicated. There are plenty of trans kids for whom the countryside is their home. They might not identify with the mainstream or urban life, and they deserve a safe place to live in rural America. Yet, oftentimes, when we're being told about the wants and desires of rural America, it really just means straight old white people. You might be thinking, aren't we getting a little far from the Oz books? But I would say no. Is that not one of the joys of literature? That we are able to take these kind of basic premises of stories and use it to fuel our own imagination and apply it to the world today. I mean, the Oz books wouldn't be so popular if they were not so relevant today. After all, that's what Gregory Maguire did with Wicked, taking certain elements of the book, such as the political tensions between different groups of people in Oz, or the role of women, and building a whole story around that. So I just wanted to draw attention to this other book, The Marvelous Land of Oz, because I feel like it is so underloved, and I think because of this Ozma storyline, it hasn't been adapted, which is kind of crazy given that, Wicked is popping off, and there's been so many adaptations of the original Oz books. And honestly, the only example I could really find tried to adapt the book into a game, but they actually cut the entire Ozma storyline and just crowned Tick as the King of Oz, which American children's media loves to do. It's like how they changed Zoisite into a girl in the dub of Sailor Moon because, God forbid, children get exposed to the gays. Which, given that they also called an onigiri a jelly donut, I think it's pretty clear that they were just on some bullshit back then.
Have a donut. That always cheers me up.
Maybe Americans didn't understand a rice ball, but they also know this isn't a donut, right? I don't know what they were thinking there. All of this comes back to the idea that we love to vilify people who are different from us or people that we don't understand, rather than grappling with the nuances and complexities of their experience and trying to figure out how we all relate to each other in this shared world. We would rather isolate and cast them out of society, which is exactly the theme for Wicked. There we have it. Full circle, baby. Okay. That's all I have from here. This was kind of a rambling essay. I don't even know if it's coherent enough to have an essay. Maybe it's more of a collection of thoughts. But I've been watching, the Wicked press tour, and yeah, it just took me back to that experience of reading these books with my dad. And even as a kid, I just really loved the message of complete freedom, and that, even if you were a little boy growing up in a rural town, that you too could be a princess one day. I even read the comics. I was obsessed with the story. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you all so much for watching. If you made it to the end of the video and for sticking with me, you made it this far, so I might as well subscribe, comment, etc. I'd love to hear your thoughts for what I should do in the next video. Okay, thanks. Bye.